For 30 years, Johnny Carson's couch was the most trusted seat in Hollywood, but behind that warm smile, some of America's biggest legends were hiding real feuds, real scandals, and secrets a studio system spent millions burying. Tonight, 9 Golden Age icons, the documented truths behind their polished TV personas, and the surprising second lives, controversies, and reinventions most people never connect to the faces they thought they knew. Number 1 alone rewrote how an entire industry viewed one of its most powerful men. Number 1 Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra's charm on camera was undeniable. The voice, the wit, the effortless cool that made him a fixture of American living rooms for decades. But for most of his career, Sinatra also lived under a cloud of documented scrutiny from the FBI, which kept a file on him running to well over 1,000 pages, tracking alleged associations with organized crime figures going back to the 1940s. The connections weren't just tabloid rumor. Sinatra was photographed and linked at various points with mob figures including Sam Giancana and congressional investigators, including the famous Kefauver Committee hearings on organized crime, repeatedly probed his business dealings. In 1963, his Nevada gaming license was pulled entirely after regulators discovered Giancana had been present at his Calneva Lodge resort, a business relationship gaming authorities considered a serious violation. Sinatra always denied any criminal involvement, and he was never charged with a crime connected to organized crime activity. But the pattern of associations was persistent enough that it shaped his public image for the rest of his career, becoming one of Hollywood's most enduring open questions. How much of the tough guy persona was performance, and how much reflected real connections he never fully explained on camera? What makes Sinatra's story even more fascinating is the sheer scale of his reinvention across decades. He nearly vanished from the public eye in the late 1940s, his singing voice damaged and his record sales collapsing, only to stage one of entertainment history's greatest comebacks by winning the Best Supporting Actor Oscar for From Here to Eternity in 1954, a role he reportedly lobbied hard for after years of being written off. That comeback launched his chairman of the board era, fronting the famous Rat Pack alongside Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr., dominating both music charts and box office simultaneously in a way almost no entertainer before or since has managed. His personal life was equally headline-grabbing. A tumultuous marriage to Ava Gardner in the early 1950s was covered obsessively by the press, adding yet another layer of tabloid fascination to a career already shadowed by federal investigators. Decades later, declassified FBI files gave researchers and biographers far more detail than was public during Sinatra's lifetime, confirming the scale of government interest even though definitive criminal ties were never proven. It remains a rare case of a beloved entertainer's private world being investigated at the highest levels of government while his public career kept climbing, seemingly uninterrupted, right up until his death in 1998. Number 2 Bette Davis. Bette Davis's sharp tongue was practically part of her brand. Audiences loved her for exactly the reasons some of her peers dreaded working with her. She became, at the time, the first actor of any gender to receive 10 Academy Award nominations, a record that stood for years and reflected a work ethic so intense that colleagues frequently described her as the hardest working person on any set she joined. No relationship captured her fierce reputation better than her legendary, decades-long feud with fellow screen legend Joan Crawford. The rivalry began in the 1930s over shared roles and rumored romantic competition, and it never cooled. It reached its peak during the filming of 1962's Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, where the two co-stars reportedly made each other's lives difficult on set through an endless string of professional jabs, disputes over billing, and public sniping in interviews for years afterward. Davis was famously candid about the feud whenever asked, rarely softening her opinions for the cameras, a rare quality for a Hollywood star of her generation, when most actresses were coached to present a united, gracious front regardless of private tensions. That bluntness became a defining part of her talk show persona. Audiences tuned in expecting unfiltered opinions, and she consistently delivered them, discussing everything from studio mistreatment to her honest assessments of younger actors' work. Beyond the Crawford feud, Davis had a documented history of standing up to the studio system itself. In 1936, she famously sued Warner Brothers to break her contract, arguing the studio was forcing her into substandard films beneath her talent, a case she ultimately lost in a British court, but one that nonetheless pressured the studio into offering her better roles afterward, and became a landmark moment in actors challenging the old studio contract system. During World War II, Davis co-founded the Hollywood Canteen, a club that provided free entertainment, food, and dancing for servicemen shipping out to war, personally donating significant time and money to keep it running. It became one of the most celebrated wartime morale efforts in Hollywood history and reflected a side of her public service rarely associated with her sharp-edged screen and interview persona. The Crawford-Davis rivalry became such a cultural touchstone that it was eventually dramatized in the FX anthology series few decades later, introducing the story to an entirely new generation who'd never seen either actress's original films. What made Davis compelling television wasn't scandal. It was her refusal to perform false modesty in an industry built on carefully managed images, making her one of the few stars willing to say exactly what she thought on camera about colleagues, directors, and the business itself. Number 3. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford's Tonight Show appearances showcased exactly the image decades of studio grooming had built: flawless posture, rehearsed charm, and an untouchable old Hollywood polish shaped by one of the most dramatic rags-to-riches stories in the industry. Born into poverty and working a string of low-wage jobs before breaking into film, Crawford became a symbol of relentless self-reinvention, famously winning the Best Actress Oscar for 1945's Mildred Pierce in a role widely seen as a comeback after MGM had dropped her. But just years after her final TV appearances, that polished image cracked permanently, thanks to one book. In 1978, Crawford's adopted daughter Christina published Mommy Dearest, a memoir alleging years of abuse hidden behind Crawford's public image of devoted motherhood. The book became a sensation precisely because it contradicted everything audiences thought they knew. The same composed, generous persona viewers saw on talk shows was, according to Christina's account, radically different behind closed doors. What makes this story so enduring isn't just the allegations themselves, but how completely they upended Crawford's legacy and how contested they remain. Several of Crawford's other children, including her twin daughters Kathy and Cindy, publicly disputed Christina's account after the book's release, describing a different mother than the one depicted, a disagreement within Crawford's own family that has never been fully resolved and adds a genuinely complicated layer to how historians assess the memoir's claims today. The book was later adapted into a campy, widely mocked 1981 film starring Faye Dunaway, which ironically cemented wire hangers as a pop culture punchline rather than a serious allegation, something Christina Crawford herself has spoken about with frustration over the years, feeling her account got flattened into comedy rather than taken seriously as a story about family trauma. Away from the abuse allegations, Crawford's later life took an unusual business turn. After marrying Pepsi-Cola CEO Alfred Steele in 1955, she became deeply involved in the company, joining its board of directors after his death in 1959 and traveling internationally to promote the brand, an almost unheard-of second act for a Golden Age film star, blending her celebrity with genuine corporate involvement well before celebrity brand ambassador became a common career path. What's genuinely fascinating is the gap between the two Joan Crawfords, the one audiences watch deliver polished answers on national television and represent a major American corporation, and the one her own family members later described in starkly conflicting terms. It remains one of the most famous and most contested examples in entertainment history of a gulf between a Golden Age star's public image and the private reality only their own family could speak to, and even they didn't agree. Number 4. Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis built one of the most successful entertainment careers of the 20th century, first as half of the wildly popular Martin and Lewis comedy duo, which dominated nightclubs, radio, film, and television throughout the late 1940s and early 50s before an acrimonious split in 1956 that reportedly left both men refusing to speak for years afterward. Lewis went on to a hugely successful solo career as an actor, director, and innovator. His directing work included a genuinely significant technical contribution to filmmaking. Lewis is widely credited with inventing an early version of Video Assist, a system allowing directors to immediately review a scene on video after filming it on film stock. A workflow innovation that eventually became standard across the entire industry and is still used today in modified form on productions worldwide. For over 4 decades, Lewis was also the face of the Muscular Dystrophy Association's annual Labor Day telethon, which raised over $2 billion for research and patient services during his tenure, one of the largest sustained charity fundraising efforts by a single entertainer in American history. But the telethon itself became the center of a genuine, well-documented controversy within the disability rights community. Starting in the 1990s, disability activists, including many people with muscular dystrophy themselves, publicly criticized Lewis's approach, arguing that his framing of disabled people as objects of pity rather than as capable individuals reinforced harmful stereotypes about disability. The criticism grew loud enough that it had a name: Jerry's Orphans, a group founded by former telethon poster children who felt the show's emotional appeals, urging viewers to donate so kids wouldn't have to be half a person, did real damage to how the public perceived people with disabilities. Lewis defended his approach publicly for years, occasionally clashing sharply with critics in interviews and magazine profiles, standing firmly behind his methods even as the broader cultural conversation around disability representation shifted dramatically around him. Interestingly, while Lewis's American film career cooled in later decades, he remained an enormous star in France, where critics and filmmakers embraced his work as genuinely innovative comedic filmmaking. France awarded him the Legion of Honor, one of the country's highest civilian honors, a level of international critical respect that stood in sharp contrast to how some American critics dismissed his films during the same period, making him one of the more genuinely divisive figures in film criticism history, beloved on one continent and underestimated on another. This tension made Lewis a uniquely complicated figure, simultaneously one of philanthropy's most effective fundraisers by sheer dollar totals, a legitimate technical innovator whose contributions changed how films are made, and a lightning rod for exactly the kind of disability advocacy debate that would reshape how telethons and charity campaigns approached representation in the decades that followed his tenure. Number 5. Orson Welles. By the time Orson Welles became a fixture of the 1970s talk show circuit, he was decades removed from Citizen Kane, and increasingly known less for new films than for being, simply, a phenomenal talker. His interview appearances were legendary for a specific reason. He rarely stuck to a script or a time slot, preferring to let stories unfold at their own length regardless of the format around him. Welles had built his entire career on defying convention from the very beginning. In 1938, years before Citizen Kane, his radio adaptation of H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds caused a genuine, documented wave of public alarm, with newspaper reports at the time describing panicked listeners who believed an actual Martian invasion was underway, an event that instantly made the 23-year-old Welles a household name and demonstrated his singular gift for commanding an audience's attention through performance alone. He carried that same audacity into film, famously wresting total creative control from RKO Pictures as a 25-year-old for Citizen Kane in 1941, an almost unheard-of arrangement for a first-time director. Ironically, the film that's now routinely ranked among the greatest ever made was a box office disappointment on release, partly due to publisher William Randolph Hearst's efforts to suppress it, believing the film was a thinly veiled and unflattering portrait of his own life. That same instinct for controlling the narrative around him followed Welles into the talk show era decades later, where hosts often found him steering conversations wherever he wanted them to go. His storytelling ability was so widely admired that many hosts simply let him run long rather than erupt. His anecdotes about Hollywood's early days, his feuds with studios, and his sprawling, unfinished projects became some of the most quoted talk show moments of the era. This reputation extended well beyond any single show. Welles was famous throughout the industry for a career defined by unfinished, underfunded passion projects, most notably The Other Side of the Wind, a film he worked on intermittently for over a decade that remained unfinished at the time of his death in 1985, largely due to financing and rights disputes. It was finally completed and released by others using his notes and footage more than 30 years later, in 2018, a genuinely remarkable coda to a project many assumed would never see daylight. In his later years, Wells also became a familiar voice to American audiences through television commercials, most famously for Paul Masson wine, where his booming, theatrical delivery of the line about the company selling no wine before its time became a widely recognized catchphrase, a strange but telling final chapter for a man once considered the most promising filmmaker of his generation, now selling wine between talk show appearances. That mix of towering genius and complete refusal to compromise made him a fascinating, occasionally exhausting interview subject right up to the end of his career. Number 6. Mickey Rooney. Mickey Rooney's career arc is one of the most dramatic in Hollywood history, from being the single biggest box office draw in America between 1939 and 1941, ahead of every other star in the industry, including established adult actors, to a much rockier personal and financial life that played out publicly for decades afterward. Rooney's fame in that era rested heavily on the massively popular Andy Hardy film series, in which he played an idealized version of small-town American youth across more than a dozen films, a character so beloved that Rooney reportedly received a special Juvenile Academy Award in 1939 partly in recognition of the series' cultural impact, alongside his other film work of that period. Away from the screen, Rooney was married 8 times, a number that became something of a running joke on the talk show circuit, and in his own self-deprecating commentary about his romantic history. His brief, highly publicized marriage to a young Ava Gardner in the early 1940s, when he was already one of the biggest stars in the world and she was just beginning her career, kept his personal life in tabloids for years, even as his adult film career struggled to match his childhood stardom. Financial troubles compounded the personal chaos. Despite earning enormous sums during his peak years as a child and young adult star, Rooney later filed for bankruptcy in 1962, citing mismanaged finances and the costs of his multiple marriages and divorces, a cautionary tale that industry commentators and later child star advocacy groups frequently referenced when discussing the financial risks facing young performers who don't control their own earnings. His talk show appearances in the 1970s often leaned into this turbulent history for laughs, with Rooney playing the self-aware elder statesman, joking about his own chaotic past rather than avoiding it. That willingness to publicly poke fun at his own missteps made him a reliably entertaining guest, even as his box office relevance had long since faded from its peak decades earlier. Rooney's career experienced a genuine, well-documented late-career resurgence as well. He earned an Emmy Award for his role in the 1981 television movie Bill, playing a man with an intellectual disability, a performance widely praised by critics as one of the finest of his long career and proof that his talent extended well beyond the boyish charm that made him famous decades earlier. In his final years, Rooney also became a vocal advocate against elder abuse, testifying before a U.S. Senate committee in 2011 about his own experiences, using his platform to highlight an issue that had personally affected him. Rooney's story is ultimately one of Hollywood's most extreme examples of meteoric early fame, followed by decades of very public financial struggle, professional reinvention, and eventual advocacy work, a narrative arc few child stars before or since have navigated so visibly, for better and worse, in front of the entire country, right up until his death in 2014. Number 7. Jane Russell. Jane Russell was one of the defining sex symbols of 1940s and 50s Hollywood, launched to fame by Howard Hughes's provocative marketing for The Outlaw, a 1943 film so controversial for its promotional imagery that it faced years of delayed release and censorship battles with the Motion Picture Production Code before finally reaching wide theaters. That early controversy defined much of the public conversation around Russell for years, often overshadowing her actual acting range. She later cemented her stardom with classics like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, alongside Marilyn Monroe, a film that showcased genuine comedic timing and musical numbers, proving there was considerably more to her career than the censorship battles that first made her famous. Russell was also a trained singer, releasing several albums and performing musical numbers throughout her film career, a talent that talk show hosts frequently highlighted when she appeared. Away from the screen, Russell built a legacy that surprised many who only knew her glamorous on-screen image. In 1955, she founded WAIF, an organization dedicated to helping facilitate international and interracial adoptions at a time when such adoptions faced enormous social and legal obstacles in the United States. Her advocacy work stemmed from her own experience adopting children after facing infertility, and it became a genuine, decades-long commitment rather than a passing celebrity cause. Waif continued facilitating adoptions for years afterward. Russell was also unusually candid in interviews about her personal Christian faith, discussing it openly at a time when many stars kept religious views private to avoid alienating parts of their audience. That openness made her a somewhat unconventional talk show guest. Audiences tuning in expecting glamour often found themselves hearing about adoption reform and personal faith instead of typical Hollywood promotional chatter. Later in life, Russell became publicly associated with conservative political causes, campaigning for Republican candidates, including Ronald Reagan, a political identity she discussed openly rather than avoiding, unusual for a star whose fame was built on a carefully managed studio image decades earlier. In her final years, she also became a recognizable face in television commercials for arthritis medication, discussing her own struggles with the condition candidly with a national audience. Russell's story is a reminder that some of the era's most photographed sex symbols were also using their fame for causes far removed from their on-screen image: adoption reform, religious advocacy, and later, health awareness, dimensions of her career that are often overshadowed by her more famous and more controversial film roles from the 1940s and 50s. Number 8. Zsa Gabor. Zsa Zsa Gabor didn't just play a glamorous diva on television. She openly embraced the persona as her actual brand, turning what could have been a liability into one of the most recognizable celebrity personas of the mid-20th century. Gabor was famously candid in interviews about prioritizing style, luxury, and image, once quipping in a widely quoted line that she never hated a man enough to give his diamonds back, the kind of self-aware, over-the-top humor that made her talk show appearances consistently entertaining rather than simply difficult. Her reputation for elaborate personal requirements was well known throughout the industry, and rather than hiding it, Gabor leaned into the image, treating her own high-maintenance reputation as part of the show. That self-awareness is a big part of why she was booked so consistently for decades. She understood that audiences weren't just tuning in for her film work, but for the larger-than-life character she'd built and maintained across countless public appearances. Gabor came from a genuinely famous family of Hungarian-American sisters. She and her siblings Eva and Magda Gabor were all well-known actresses and socialites in their own right, giving the family a level of collective tabloid fame that few celebrity families of that era could match, with all three sisters frequently discussed together in gossip columns as a kind of glamorous package deal. Her 9 marriages became almost as famous as her acting career, providing endless material for both her own jokes and host banter across decades of television appearances. She discussed her romantic history with the same theatrical flair she brought to everything else, turning what could have been tabloid fodder into a signature comedic bit that she controlled and performed rather than something done to her. Gabor's public persona took a genuinely dramatic real-world turn in 1989 when she was arrested after a widely publicized altercation with a Beverly Hills police officer during a traffic stop, ultimately serving a short jail sentence, a real, well-documented legal incident that briefly made her a tabloid fixture in an entirely different way than her decades of glamorous talk show appearances, and one she later discussed publicly with characteristic wit rather than avoiding it. What made her enduringly popular wasn't scandal in the traditional sense. It was that she'd essentially invented a persona, the glamorous, marriage-hopping European socialite, decades before reality television made that kind of self-aware celebrity performance common. In many ways, Gabor functioned as a genuine precursor to the reality TV personalities of later decades, someone famous largely for skillfully performing a heightened version of herself in public, making her a legitimate pioneer of a specific type of talk show and tabloid stardom that wouldn't become common until long after her peak fame. Number 9. Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters was a 2-time Oscar winner, known as much for her outspoken, unfiltered personality as for her acting range across decades of film work. Unlike stars who carefully guarded a polished image, Winters was famous for saying exactly what she thought, regardless of the venue, a trait shaped in part by her serious training at the Actors Studio under method acting pioneers, an intense, psychologically rigorous approach that many of her contemporaries credited with shaping her direct, unfiltered public persona. Her most talked about unscripted moment happened not on Carson's show but on a British talk show, where she reportedly threw a glass of whiskey at fellow guest Oliver Reed after he made comments she considered sexist, an incident that became one of the most replayed unscripted moments of the talk show era and cemented her reputation as an entertainer who refused to just sit quietly through disagreements, regardless of who was watching. Winters won her first Academy Award for 1959's The Diary of Anne Frank, playing Mrs. Van Don, and her second for 1965's A Patch of Blue, establishing her as a genuinely respected dramatic actress, even as her larger-than-life talk show persona sometimes overshadowed her serious film work in the public imagination. She was also known for deep political engagement at a time when many stars avoided controversial topics on air. She spoke openly about social and political causes she cared about, often steering lighthearted segments into more serious territory, a habit that made producers occasionally nervous, but consistently made for memorable television that stood apart from more predictable celebrity interviews of the era. Winters later became known for a series of remarkably candid memoirs, published starting in the 1980s, in which she discussed her personal relationships and Hollywood experiences with a level of openness that was considered shocking for a star of her generation, when most autobiographies stuck to carefully sanitized, studio-approved narratives. Her willingness to write so directly about her own life added another dimension to the same unfiltered honesty that had defined her television appearances for decades. That willingness to break format wasn't calculated for controversy. Those who worked with her generally described it as reflecting genuine conviction rather than a publicity strategy. She treated every public appearance, and later every page of her memoirs, as a chance to say something she actually believed, format expectations aside. Winters' legacy captures something specific about the era, a performer talented enough to win multiple Academy Awards and train seriously in one of the era's most respected acting methodologies, but never willing to trade authenticity for the smoother, more predictable persona late-night television often rewarded, making her one of the more unpredictable, genuinely memorable guests of her generation, on camera and on the page.